Russia, mid-June 1941. A bewildered, uncertain country. Rumors abounded of invasion by Hitler's Germany. Here in the Kremlin, Russia's leaders seemed oblivious of the Nazi threat. Or if not oblivious, then complacent, as if by ignoring it, it might disappear. Yet already, millions of German troops were poised along Russia's border to launch the bloodiest land battle in history. The battle that was eventually to decide the Second World War.
Soldaten durch die Stadt marschieren, öffnen die Mädchen Fenster und die Türen. Ein Warum, ein Warum, ein Warum, ein Warum, ein Schuss gegen den Schiff, Rassabum, Rassasam. Ein Schuss gegen den Schiff, Rassabum, Rassasam.
Hitler in July 1940, returning from France in triumph, stood at the pinnacle of his power.
Die Mädchen hast so gerne, ein Warum, ein Warum, ein Warum, ein Warum, ein Schuss gegen den Schiff, Rassabum, Rassasam. Ein Schuss gegen den Schiff, Rassabum, Rassasam.
The speed and sureness of his victories had astonished even his generals. Their doubts had been answered, their opposition could be discounted. It was now that Hitler confided to them it would be the Russians' turn next. In Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler had written, "When we speak of new territory, we must think of Russia. Destiny itself points the way there." Russia would provide living space for the German folk. Lebensraum. The ordinary German, like the ordinary Russian or the ordinary person anywhere, had been surprised by Hitler's pact with Stalin in August 1939. To him, as to them, it had seemed the least likely about face by the world's bitterest rivals. The Nazi-Soviet pact had served its purpose for Hitler. He had not been hindered while he dealt with Poland and France. Stalin, for his part, gained a breathing space while he put his army in order after the bloodletting purges of the 30s. He had gambled, too, on a lengthy struggle between Germany and the Allies. But the German victories in the West had been swifter than he had expected.
Hitler wanted to attack Russia already in the fall of 1940 and let himself, for once, be persuaded that it would be impossible to go to war at that late time on account of the weather in Russia and for the reason that it would be urgent and necessary to enforce the German army as well as the German Air Force before entering into this new campaign.
In August 1939, when Hitler had signed the pact with Russia, in the evenings there was a movie, and this movie showed the parade of the Russian troops before the Kremlin. He was very much impressed and was relieved that now with the pact this army is neutralized. But afterwards, when the German troops met the Russian ones in occupying Poland, officers reported to Hitler that the equipment of those Russian units were very poor. He first didn't believe it so much, but then when the Russians attacked the Finns and they didn't have any progress, he was convinced that this was really the truth. And he was now considering the Russian army no more as strong as before.
Doubts about the Red Army's strength had been raised inside Russia itself. For the purges of the 30s had decimated its leadership. 90% of its generals, 80% of its colonels, and well over half its corps commanders had been put to death at Stalin's whim.
Every single commander of a military district was eliminated. Every single commander of an army division has been eliminated. Every single commander of a regiment, with some exceptions here, also eliminated. Now, you see, this is a little more than political weakness. The army was beheaded, so to speak.
After the Red Army's poor performance against the Finns, steps were taken to reform it. When the news reached Moscow of the Wehrmacht's crushing of the French, these reforms were accelerated. They were still incomplete by the summer of 1940. All the same, Stalin seized his chance while Hitler was preoccupied with the battle for Britain to grab first the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and then within the same month, those parts of Romania known as Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. A move that, in Hitler's eyes, brought Russian troops uncomfortably close to the Romanian oil wells at Ploesti, Germany's only oil supply, vital for its tanks and planes and ships. But with the bulk of his forces still in the west, Hitler did not intervene. Instead, he stepped up diplomatic pressure to woo the Balkans into the German fold. First, King Boris of Bulgaria was invited to visit Hitler that autumn at Berchtesgaden, and he was followed by Prince Paul of Yugoslavia and by young King Michael of Romania. Michael was already under the sway of his pro-German Prime Minister, Antonescu. When news broke that Romania and Hungary had joined the Axis, the Russians reacted sharply. They accused Berlin of violating the spirit of the August 1939 pact. The frail Soviet-German friendship was beginning to fall apart. Hitler that same month further strengthened the Axis. He signed a new military alliance with Italy and with Japan, the Tripartite Pact. It was aimed allegedly at only the United States and Britain. The Russians thought otherwise. They protested angrily. Hitler invited Stalin's closest advisor, Molotov, to Berlin that November 1940 to help, as he put it, clarify the situation. It was a disastrous visit for Soviet-German relations.
When Molotov visited Berlin, he was obviously afraid of being poisoned by bacterials, and he asked that all the plates, all the glasses he used, are boiled before they came in use.
He was blunt in his remarks, and he didn't spare Hitler at all. Very uncompromising, hardly smiling at all, reminding me of my mathematics teacher with the spectacles, hostile spectacles, looking at his pupil Hitler and saying, well, is our agreement, last year's agreement, still valid? And Hitler said thought it was a mistranslation. He said, of course, why not? And Molotov said, yes, I asked this question because of the Finns. You are on very friendly relations with the Finns. You invite people from Finland to Germany and you send missions there. And the Finns are very dangerous people. They undermine our security, and we'll have to do something about that. And we are going to do something about that. Whereupon Hitler exploded and said, I understand you very well. You want to wage war on against Finland. And that is quite out of the question. Do you hear me? Impossible, because my supplies of iron and of nickel and of other important raw materials would be cut. It was a very tough, almost a heavyweight championship in political discussion.
Even while Molotov was still in Berlin, Hitler ordered his generals to plan an attack on Russia for May the 15th, 1941. They responded with a detailed scheme which he now named Operation Barbarossa, after the red-bearded Prussian emperor who centuries earlier had crusaded against the Slavs. Hitler's generals had taken some convincing, for to attack Russia with Britain still resisting was to fight a war on two fronts, something that even Mein Kampf maintained to be the gravest of military mistakes. But Hitler argued, and with some truth that winter of 1940, that Britain, although not beaten, was not a threat. So an eastern campaign would be the only front, provided it was over quickly. Years earlier, Hitler had written, "Armies do not exist for peace. They exist solely for triumphant exertion in war." The Wehrmacht's morale was at its height. Where was it to march next? It couldn't move against Britain on land, and amphibious warfare was not to Hitler's liking. Magnetism alone, it seemed, must draw it against its sole remaining antagonist within Europe. Draw it in the same way as Napoleon's armies had been drawn when they too had been left champing at the bit along the Channel, eastwards, ever eastwards, to the boundless motherland of Russia. Red Army in 1941 was the largest in the world. In tanks it outnumbered, in airplanes it equaled the rest of the world's armies put together. Despite its shortcomings, the Red Army was better equipped than previous Wehrmacht victims, and its reorganization since the fiasco of the Finnish War was well underway. But what of its morale? Hitler felt sure he knew the answer. You have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. Russia's leaders still thought they could buy time while their army made ready for the struggle. By March 1941, Russian troops were already being faced by German troops along the borders of Hungary and Romania and even Bulgaria. Yugoslavia, too, looked like becoming a German satellite until, encouraged by British intelligence, a popular uprising in Belgrade pushed out the Nazi puppets. Incredibly, Moscow concluded a pact with the rebels. The very next day, Hitler attacked Yugoslavia. Incensed by the revolt, he named the operation Retribution. Operation Retribution meant postponing Operation Barbarossa by 5 crucial weeks. But now Russia stood by while the Wehrmacht overran her newest ally. Hitler marched into Greece, again without Moscow so much as protesting. This inaction cannot have been lost on Hitler. It made him even more headstrong as his armies swept on to further easy victories. Stalin's own spies had been sending back reports of German troop concentrations along his borders, reports which he chose to ignore. When Western diplomats warned him too, he again shrugged them off. He argued to his cronies that however inevitable a Nazi-Soviet conflict might be, these present reports were simply a British ruse.
The interesting thing was that both Roosevelt and Churchill, each on their own, informed Stalin that Hitler was going to attack Russia. Stalin thought that was a trick on our part to get him to mobilize and to provoke Hitler to attack. Stalin was very conscious that in World War I, it was the Tsar's mobilization that caused the Kaiser, to attack Russia, and he wasn't going to have any part of it.
There is a traditional pathological mistrust. When the British say something, Stalin's philosophy used to tell us, you must think the opposite. The British warn us. That must mean that they try to put us against the Germans. For that reason alone, the main reason, he neglected all the warnings.
May Day in Moscow, 1941. Particularly impressive military parade, as if to reassure the Russian people in the face of all the rumors of impending invasion.
Танкисты и стрелки, если нам любимый вождь прикажет,
Russian diplomacy was still aimed at appeasing Hitler, hoping to delay any attack until the Red Army's reforms would be complete. And so, while the generals lectured, the diplomats rushed grain and much-needed raw materials to Germany, turned a blind eye to the incursions of German reconnaissance planes over Soviet territory, and even slowed down their building of frontier defenses so as not to offend Berlin. Yet even as Stalin's defense commissar shook hands with Hitler's military attaché in Moscow, 3 million German troops were moving up to the border. The biggest land battle in history was about to begin.
Was all the greater when it did come. I remember that particular night I'd been out somewhere and came home rather late and turned on the radio, and I got on to, I think it was Kharkov or Kiev or somewhere like that, and there were accounts going on of bombing and attacks and things, which I thought was a sort of Orson Welles program, like when he bombed New York, remember? And, and then we checked around and found it was real.
Told that the Red Army will never fight on its own territory, that the very first shot will be made on enemy's territory, etc. Then suddenly on 22nd, we were told that Sevastopol is being bombed, Kiev is being bombed, Smolensk bombed, the enemy smashed, wiped out our forces.
After the success of the other campaigns, we had confidence that Barbarossa would be successful too.
The first period of the advance was very quick. We made more than 100 kilometers, partly per day.
We hadn't lost the battle, so we were used to being victorious.
Hitler's plan was for 3 vast armies to seek out and destroy the Russian forces within 4 months.
I never was in war before. We had no fear, because we thought we will win the war against Russia, because the wars against Poland and France, we had ended with victories for Germany.
As well as surprise, the Germans had the advantage of overwhelming superiority in men and firepower at those points chosen for their armored thrusts. 3 Russian infantry divisions were annihilated that first day, and another 5 cut to pieces.
During the River Bug crossing, we were attacked by several obsolete Russian aircraft. They were shot down immediately, and we were very impressed by the superiority of our Air Force at the beginning.
During the first 2 days, 2,000 Russian planes were destroyed, mostly on the ground. the world's largest air force had been well nigh eradicated. Their air cover gone, the Russian frontier armies wilted and disappeared. In a week, the Wehrmacht was already halfway to Moscow. In a month, the Germans had won an area double the size of their own country.
Wenn die Soldaten durch die Stadt marschieren, öffnen die Mädchen Fenster und die Türen. Ein Warum, ein Warum, ein Warum, ein Warum, ein Schuss gegen den Schiff, Rassabum, Rassasam. Ein Schuss gegen den Schiff, Rassabum, Rassasam. Zwei brave Tücher, Schnauzbach und Sterne, Herzen zum Küssen, die Mädchen ach so gerne. Ein Warum, ein Warum, ein Warum, ein Warum, ein Schuss gegen den Schiff, Rassabum, Rassasam. Ein Schuss gegen den Schiff, Rassabum, Rassasam.
Russian cities fell like ninepins to the panzers. One was captured with its trams still running. Its citizens setting off for work cheered the German tanks, thinking them their own.
We were, in parts, very friendly received by the population. We had the impression that we could win the population in Russia.
Like the French the summer before, the Russians used their tanks in penny packets instead of the massed formations of the German panzers. Easy meat for the German anti-tank gunners. Their blazing hulks littered the battlefield. 6,000 Russian tanks were lost in just 2 engagements at Minsk and Smolensk in July. Half a million Russians were killed in the first fortnight, and nearly 1 million taken prisoner. As the weeks went by, the Russian losses mounted, bewildering the Germans, who refused to believe such profligacy in human life could possibly continue. As in France the year before, Hitler was concerned more to destroy the enemy's forces in the field than to capture cities or to conquer territory. But his generals didn't always see it that way. Tempted, perhaps, by golden spires, they vied with each other to be the captor of this or that great city, especially Moscow. To capture the Russian capital without delay, the generals argued, would be decisive. Hitler preferred to destroy the Russian forces in the south first, hoping for a decisive battle there. Moscow was not his first priority. In August, he ordered his panzers to swing south. Kiev, the capital of the Ukraine, was taken in mid-September. In one of the most spectacular encircling movements in military history, the German panzers took prisoner at Kiev nearly 750,000 Russians. The German newsreel cameramen made great play of these long columns of luckless Russians for whom frontline fighting was now over. But ahead lay another hell, imprisonment at the hands of the Nazis. Of every 100 Russian prisoners seen here, only 3 would ever return alive. By the end of September 41, after just 3 months of war, the Russians had lost nearly 3 million men. But Russian resilience before such fatal-seeming blows was to astonish the world. The German was told to regard his Russian foe as subhuman, but it was not long before the German frontline soldier at least came to think of him as more superhuman than subhuman. The Russians seldom cried out when wounded, and there always seemed to be more of them on the horizon. One Wehrmacht colonel wrote, "In fighting Russia, the German army is like an elephant attacking a host of ants. The elephant will kill thousands, maybe millions, but in the end, their numbers will overcome him, and he will be eaten to the bone."
Orientation in Russia is as difficult as it is in the desert. Only you don't see the horizon, you are lost.
The immense space was so immense that we had many of soldiers who became melancholy. The valley, flat valleys, flat hills, endless. There was no limit. We could not see an end. And it was so disconsolate.
We saw the big fields, the cornfields. From the horizon to the horizon, we never saw it before. It's a very large,
unimaginable vastness of this country. And we advanced from one river to the other, from one position to the other, and there was no end to it.
Trade space for time was the traditional Russian strategy. Time was not on Hitler's side if he was to achieve his decisive victory before winter.
I remember flying back from Kuibyshev, and there was this great tank trap they were digging all round outside Moscow, and one saw what looked like ants moving around it, and it was practically the entire civil population of Moscow, man, woman, and child, who were out there digging. I think they did tap every emotional resource that was available to them. I remember, for instance, a lot of the churches being open again that had been shut for a long time.
In that very situation, something else appeared among us, the tradition of Borodino. Borodino is the place where Napoleon was defeated. Then suddenly, religious feeling just appeared from nowhere, and that helped to unite people.
With the Ukraine subdued and Leningrad surrounded, Hitler now turned his attention to the biggest prize of all, Moscow. Something his generals had been beseeching him to do ever since the start of the campaign. Moscow in October 41 was already a frontline city. German troops had been only 200 miles away since August, when Hitler had diverted his panzers southwards. Rumors had been rife of early capitulation. The city had long been placed under military rule. Hardly a day went by without a visit from the Luftwaffe. The battle for Moscow began in earnest in early October. Straightway, things went wrong for its defenders. In two vast pincer movements, the Germans captured another 700,000 Russian troops. Goebbels summoned American war correspondents to Berlin to announce Moscow's impending fall.
We had had a very beautiful summer. No problems, climatic problems or anything of this sort. As I remember it, it started snowing and becoming cold around October 10th. And then we knew immediately that we were totally unprepared and unequipped for what was lying ahead of us.
But when one panzer commander asked his headquarters when he could expect winter clothing, he was told not to make further unnecessary requests of this type. On the day the first snows fell before Moscow, its defenders received a new commander, Zhukov. Something German intelligence didn't consider worth telling Hitler, although Zhukov had led Leningrad's defense with enormous energy since mid-September. But Moscow's defense was to be a bigger test of Zhukov's generalship. The first snows soon melted, turning roads into quagmires.
Only a few roads in Russia were paved. Therefore, in autumn, the terrible period of mud was beginning, and the roads became deeply softened and therefore useless for motor cars except tanks.
We had, as infantry, to march along the sides of the roads to let pass the cars and the tanks.
The wheels of my guns were broken.
And within a period of 2 or 3 days, we had to improvise mobility by requisitioning pannier horses and wagons.
We all were quite happy about the success of the German armies in Russia, but the first inkling that something is wrong was when Goebbels made a big action in whole Germany to collect furs and winter clothes for the German troops. Then we knew that something was ahead which was not foreseen.
We had no warm mantles and nothing, only the things we had also in summertime.
And we were actually angry that we didn't have better equipment.
The weather worsened. Many German commanders favored halting for the winter. Hitler would have none of it. Convinced total victory would be his before winter proper began, he ordered his generals on as soon as the ground had hardened enough to bear his panzers. The welcome delay allowed Zhukov to organize Moscow's defenses. The Russians had less than 400 tanks left to defend Moscow. Space was running out fast for Zhukov, but time was still on his side as the cold winds of winter swept in from the north. But On October the 14th, a panzer group broke through and took Kalinin, less than 100 miles away to the north. A few days later, another unit took Mozhaisk, 60 miles west, while an infantry division reached Gorky, just 40 miles away. Panic gripped Moscow's citizens. Those who could left, 2 million of them, including most government departments. Even Lenin's coffin was evacuated, along with other Kremlin treasures.
It was a bit of a shock when, in those 2 or 3 days, I suppose they were just the advance, sort of spear tip, probably a few chaps on motorbikes or something, got to within 40 or 50 kilometers of Moscow. Then there was, I must say, a considerable shock in Moscow, and people were trying to get out. They thought the German army was going to roll in.
In fact, I should imagine from 16th of October to about 20th of October, an average citizen of Moscow probably expected that Moscow will fall within the next few days, and that was what the panic was about, really. People used just to stop top-ranking Secret Service officers and shout insults at them without any fear. In normal times, you couldn't do anything like that. These were the only times when probably a very weak force of Germans, if they would manage to drop a unit of some kind of parachutist inside, we would have real trouble.
But while Hitler plotted his final attack on Moscow, Zhukov too planned an attack. But with what? He had already withdrawn as many troops as he dared from other sectors to defend Moscow. But there was one reserve the Russians had not yet touched, nor ever thought they would be able to. The 40 divisions of the Siberian Front, among the best troops in Russia, trained to fight in winter conditions. Since June, they had been expecting a Japanese attack. Midway through October, Stalin's master spy in Tokyo reported Japan's eyes were elsewhere. This time, Stalin believed his spies. He moved the Siberian divisions to Moscow. Even at this moment of crisis, Moscow took time off to celebrate the anniversary of the revolution, and Stalin showed himself to his people.
We could say, in spite of all his shortcomings, that Stalin rendered a very great service to the USSR by that presence, because it showed two things. One, the Supreme Commander did not run away. Secondly, Stalin retained his nerve. That sense of nerve spread at once into all the armed forces. All the commanders began saying, Stalin himself, he is here.
The ground had hardened. The panzers were able to roll again. On November the 26th, they entered Istra, just 30 miles west of Moscow. 4 days later, had taken Krasnaya Polyana, just 25 miles north. As yet, Zhukov had not used his Siberians, and German intelligence had not stumbled on the presence near Moscow of such numbers of fresh troops. But the Germans were having troubles of their own.
And one morning, it was finished with this. All was frozen. And the cars was sitting in the mud, frozen, and the tanks could not roll. And in this moment, my heart broke down. And there was in a distance a large town. And I think that was the first time and the last time I have seen Moscow.
Temperatures were down to minus 40 degrees centigrade. Oil solidified in the sumps of lorries and tanks. The intense cold affected the soldiers too. There were more casualties from frostbite and stomach troubles than from actual fighting.
We had no winter shoes. We had no equipment whatsoever to fight or stand the cold. And I think this became a very, very big problem right away. We lost considerable part of our equipment, guns, heavy and light equipment in general. We, of course, due to the cold, lost a lot of people who got frostbitten. And we had not even the necessary amount of ointments or the most simple and primitive things to fight it.
Of 900 men of my battalion, 200 fell out because of freezing. And the first 14 days.
As it became colder, toward the end of November and early December, most of our artillery had become completely unusable.
We had not the lubrication oil suitable for this winter war. Nevertheless, the Russian had it, and suddenly our soldier realized that from one moment to the next, the weapon didn't shoot anymore.
Well, the worst memory was if the vehicles got frozen on the ground and the motor oil was thick, so we couldn't move. And we needed and we wanted to move. I think that was the worst.
In Russia, there were no signposts to mark the ways. And to find our roads, we had set the frozen bodies of horse along the snow walls to find the way during the snow drifts. And the scenery was so disconsolate. Always snow and snow.
We always were alone with us, dreaming what time we will be back in Berlin.
But the powers that be back in Berlin refused to believe the worst. The newsreels made it all seem great fun. The reality was different.
At that time, we had advanced almost 2,000 kilometers.
Hitler at first did not want to conceive that this crisis was the end of all his strategical planning. But the army knew it better, and the Russians did the most important part in convincing Hitler too that the Russian campaign of this first year had failed and had come to an end.
December the 6th. With the Wehrmacht's morale at its lowest, although some German troops were just 15 miles from the Kremlin, Zhukov unleashed his Siberians.
It was astonishing. This time, the first time I saw the Russian tanks, 34, running through the fields and through the snow. Our own tanks couldn't drive, couldn't shoot, because it was too cold.
Wanted to go back, I met the Russians everywhere, and so this was the first impression that there was no victory anymore.
As the Russians regained some of their territory, they began to uncover the horror of the Nazi occupation. "Comrade, kill your German" became the catchphrase. Within the first month of the Russian counteroffensive, more than 300,000 Germans were killed or captured.
The worst memory of this retreat was a fear every day and every night to come in captivity.
And we had seen enough of the enemy to know that in cases like that, prisoners were hardly taken.
It was the first time that our soldiers remarked the dark shadows of the coming times.
When we must retreat from Moscow, the Russian population and the Russian soldiers must think it's possible to defeat the German army.
2 days after the Russian offensive began, the Japanese struck at Pearl Harbor. The war was taking a very different turn.